show me your faith without deeds. Prove to me you have faith. And he's going, well, I don't know how to do that. It's sort of a trick question. You have to show faith. You have to demonstrate. Well, how are you going to demonstrate it? Well, it only makes sense. I would do what God told me to do. I would be obedient. I would do good works. And so he's kind of caught him in a trap there, if you follow the dialogue a bit there. James says, show me your faith without your deeds. Well, I can't. That's impossible. So James says, well, I'll tell you what. I will show you my faith by what I do. I'll show you my faith by what I do. Well, you cannot show me your faith because you don't even have works. I will clearly prove beyond a doubt that I put my trust in Jesus Christ because my life is one of obedience. Now, again, we got to say this again and again because it's easy to be confused. James, as well as Paul, as well as John, Jesus, they say it over and over again that good works are the proof of faith, not the path of faith. In other words, good works do not save you. It's foolish to think they could. But what they do is they prove that salvation has taken place, that trust has been there. It's sort of like this, an apple tree. Now, I'm not a tree expert, and so there's only one way I would know if it's an apple tree or not. Now, some of you know trees pretty well, but let's go with the assumption most of us are like me. If I walked, along in a forest, well, there's trees everywhere. Oh, look, there's an apple tree. Now, guess how I would know that's an apple tree? Only the one easy way for me, okay? That it's got a big, juicy red apple on it. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't an apple tree to begin with, but it became very obvious and evident, even to the slowest of us, that this is an apple tree because of its fruit, because it's demonstrated. Listen to what Jesus says. Matthew 7 and verse 20. We've kind of referenced Jesus, but let's get it from his mouth. Matthew 7:20. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. How do I know? How do I know you're legitimate believers? How do I know that Jesus Christ is everything to you? Well, it's going to become evident to me, even if I'm a little slow. By your fruit. Now listen to what he says. He offers a warning, and Jesus can say this. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. You mean not everyone who says Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross for the sins of the world are going to go to heaven? Apparently not. So Jesus says, everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will not enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. What's he saying? Those who put their trust in Jesus Christ. And we know they have because something has changed. Their life has gone on a different trajectory. John 15:8, this is Jesus again. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit. He goes on, showing yourselves to believe my disciples. Now James throws the extreme example in verse 19, and we read it a moment ago. You believe that there's one God? Well, whoop-de-doo. Because even the demons believe that, and they go a step farther than you. Because they are overwhelmed by fear at that thought. That word for shudder literally means for your hair to stand on end. It would be something that would describe a cat when it gets scared. All the hair goes up on a cat. That's where this word comes from. It literally means to be overwhelmed with panic and fear and trepidation. So they have this emotional response. They know the truth. They've responded to it somehow internally, but they have never and indeed cannot put their trust in Jesus Christ. And James says, I'm not seeing a lot of difference here. If anything, I'm going to give them the credit for trembling. Verse 20, you foolish man. Do you want evidence that faith without deed is useless? And this is our segue to next week, but I want to stop there. Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? And James is very clever. And James is actually a little bit, sometimes I feel like I can get on it a little bit and just kind of, really get after it. But James just puts me to shame. I mean, he's just brutal almost. And he can do that. And I can quote him, which is nice. Now, he says, you foolish, it literally means empty head, which is a very derogatory term, as if I looked at you and said, you're an idiot. You're an idiot if you think that. Now, I wouldn't say that to you. James would. I wouldn't. I would quote James, but I wouldn't say it to you. And then he makes a play on words, and it's a bit of sarcasm because he's using a little bit of a jab here. And the word there for works and the word for useless are very similar, and they sound alike in the Greek. So the best translation in English to get the nuance of it would be faith without works doesn't work. So it's kind of a play on the words there. If you don't have faith that works, your faith doesn't work. Okay, I know that sounds confusing, which is why they didn't translate it that way in the English. But it was a play on words. Now here's my summary statement. Write this down if you're following in your notes. Knowledge of God, even an emotional response to God's truth, does not bring salvation, and we have to understand that. Because part of the problem may be that some of us have never gotten past that. Now, I think most of you have. Mainly because I've seen fruit in your lives, and I've gotten to know many of you, and you've seen the same in me. So I don't necessarily think that's our problem, although it may be part of the problem here today. And we'll address that in a moment. So the first half addresses the core issue. There has to be a volitional response in your life to Jesus. It's not just this, oh, Jesus is great, I'm going to respond emotionally, and I think he's a great guy. Although that's insufficient if that's where it stops. But it's not resulting in a changed life. And the changed life is the problem because looking at our lives and looking at our church and looking at our way our church is represented in the community, it's like, is their faith any better than demons? Again, it sounds really strong, doesn't it? But he's bringing out the extremes to make the point. That if you've really responded, you have a changed life, you know God's used you, you know you love him, you put your trust in him, you've actually seen works in your life, but you can look around and you are not serving in any way. You're not manifesting a change in your behavior in any way. Your love for people is cold. James says, he challenges you, either it's not there or it's really hard to find if it is there. I wanted to give you just a few applications there, and there's not much room there on the bottom of your bulletin worship guide, but if you can write in a few words here, and this will just give you something to think about, pray about later. What we do reveals who we are. So here's 3 areas I want to ask you about. The first one is, what about your devotion? Devotion is I'm going to use it as a synonym for worship. Is God most important to you? Do you worship God? Now the easy answer is, of course I worship God. I'm here, aren't I? And I would say, well, you know, that helps for sure. There's a lot of people that aren't here, and, you know, we can make other assumptions along that way. But you're here, great. But let's dig a little further. And I say there's 2 ways Americans can find out what they worship. It's their calendar and their checkbook. Their time and your money. You know, put it where your mouth is, James would say. Because if all of your time is self-absorbed, I mean, there are people, believe it or not, that worship their jobs. And you know it because they're putting 60, 70, 80 hours a week. There are people that worship their kids because it's always, I've got to go here, I've got to go this, I've got this thing with my kids, and it's all about my kids instead of being all about God, and I'm going to use my kids for the glory of God and raise them to the glory of God. Teaching them to serve, teaching them to worship, teaching them to love. I mean, just where's your schedule? What about your money? You know, most Americans, which would represent all of us in here, spend 104% of their income. And you don't think that's possible? Look at the government, okay? They set a great example for us. That we spend more than we take in, and guess what that means? There ain't no money, honey. That's what my dad used to say. There ain't no money, honey. And it comes down to, well, God, I really wish I could help, but, you know, my minimum payments just were raised, and I just can't quite do it. And the way we spend our money is a huge problem in the church. A huge problem in our lives. Where's your money? That'll show your devotion. Indeed, that'll show your fruit. Second word I'll give you, we'll move on, and that is morality. Morality. The way you talk, the way we think, the way we behave, and our attitudes. Now, most of us, we have come to learn the expectations, and we do what's right because it works, or because it's convenient, or because I can get away with, you know, a certain level. In other words, if there were no expectations, and I wasn't afraid of the repercussions, and if I didn't realize that it would sabotage, that I would behave even more badly than I do. And so what keeps us in check is usually some sort of repercussions or expectations, instead of this life that loves God and hates sin. And that's going to change our behavior. The way we think, the way we act, the way we talk. And then the last one, ministry. Ministry. And that is using your resources. Sort of a summary of all of that, but I'm going to give a very practical application of this. Now, look on the back of the worship guide. If you have one there, if you may